Hello and a very hot welcome back to the garden. It's yet another heat wave and it's a very challenging growing season. I've seen a lot of people who've actually had to give up on their season. So for the rest of you that are trying to hold on, hopefully this video is going to give you a load of tips and ideas to actually end the season on a positive note and use some strategies to have a lot of food over autumn and winter and help protect the soil. One of the issues when you're using compost as your primary mulch is that it's a very dark material, and that means that it absorbs the temperature of the sun, which when the soil is actually too hot, it can actually impact how well your plants grow. The other issue with compost is out of lots of other mulches, it's not very effective at retaining moisture. And usually in a British climate, that's okay because we have quite a wet climate. But this year has kind of flipped that on its head. So because of the challenges, I've really had to adapt how I've been growing this year and take the risk of using more kind of slug-prone mulches like grass clippings to protect the soil and insulate it and keep the moisture in as much as possible. Now, because of this heat and we're in the middle of another heat wave, it's kind of frustrating because it's a time when I should be sowing a lot of seeds, especially directly, to get and squeeze in extra crops over autumn and winter. But right now, I'm not going to be sowing anything. But there's actually something that you can do now to prep spare ground to get it ready for sowing seeds and get it in a nicer condition, and it's really simple. So earlier today, this empty patch here actually had field beans growing, and it's time to cut them down at the base to leave the roots in, because that's a really good way of adding carbon and organic matter to the soil and not actually disturbing it. However, right now it's kind of a rough area of ground. This is some perpetual spinach that was growing before, and it's too hot to sow anything. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring in some old plant material and I'm going to do a temporary mulch. It's a cooling mulch. Anything that is a cooler colour than, say, the soil, and anything that protects it that's usually a nice plant material is really going to lower the temperature and also retain the moisture in the ground. So I'm just going to use a bunch of old Celtis plants and some peas, not actually chop them up that much because I want them to create a nice mat and then I can rake them off after, but I'm just going to leave this on top for about 2 weeks. Hopefully the weather will cool down a little bit. I can then remove it and sow something. I think for this area I'm going to be sowing a cover crop. So an example of a cover crop here is actually mustard. This is something we planted just a few weeks back. It grows really quickly and then you just chop it down, leaving the roots in. Whilst the plant is growing, it's pumping out root exudates, so like lots of sugars and carbon to feed the soil life. And then when it's chopped like this, it's going to break down, but it's also acting as an insulating layer to keep the soil nice and cool. And I reckon in about 3 or 4 weeks time I'll be able to just transplant a few fast growing crops. But if you buy mustard as a green manure, it's incredibly cheap, it's incredibly cost effective, and it will cover a wide area. Here's another example of mustard sown here. This will probably grow for another week or two before again chopping at the base and letting that break down and actually feed the soil, because the majority of a dry mass of a plant is actually carbon-based compounds from photosynthesis. So actually creating this mass and this organic matter and adding carbon into the soil, which is such a key building block of life, you're not actually extracting any of the nutrients because it's all going to go back in plus more. That is a great thing about a cover crop. An alternative is actually lettuce. So whilst lettuce is obviously a nice delicious crop, is quite fast at growing, it's more suitable for a shady area, because if it's out in the sun in the main garden, then it's going to run to seed. But in a shadier area, lettuce also makes a nice bit of ground cover to protect the soil, and then you can chop that down again at the base and let it break down. So just a couple of alternatives. Another good cover crop that you can grow that grows really quickly and is fairly drought tolerant is actually buckwheat. This is an example here. This is actually a buckwheat that looks beautiful and I'm growing for the grain, but you can buy buckwheat as a green manure and plant it in rows, and then after, just before it starts flowering, cut it at the base and let it break down. And it's just another thing to really help the soil. Yes, for green manures, you're not feeding humans, but you are feeding the soil, which in the future is going to feed humans. This is actually purple sprouting broccoli that's been interplanted with radish to treat as a cover crop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the radish at the base, leaving the roots in. So I've got this, and then I'm just going to kind of tear it up slightly and then pack it in and around. Okay. In a garden, so right now our gardens are pretty full up. I've got amaranth here. This is kind of a tender stem broccoli. Yeah, it's I'll get. Isn't it? Mm-hmm. All right, so in our gardens right now, so usually in August the garden is quite full. For example, I've got some fennel here. This is amaranth. This is tender stem broccoli, and underneath, growing in the shade, I've also got some lettuce. So there's a lot of things happening in this area. I can't really squeeze in any crops here. However, when you do have, say, a crop that's starting to go over, this is nearing it, but I've still got a week. But for example, the Celtis back there, or anything that's really bolting, but that soil is good that it's growing in. And during August, there's actually going to be a lot of plants that are kind of going over, which we've mentioned before about like the Celtis or the peas for doing a cool mulch. The other thing you need to consider is actually the health of your soil. So if you're growing something in really healthy soil, but you've got a patch of barren soil that isn't very healthy, what you're better doing is removing those gone over plants to mulch that poor quality soil to let that build up its health again, and then transplant or sow directly where that crop was growing, so you can always ensure that something's planted in that spot. I think during a really tough season, you've got to be an optimist in the garden. I'm counting on that hopefully September will at least be cooler and we'll just get a little bit of rain to replenish the water supplies. So I'm willing to kind of make moves to cater for that. So what I'm actually going to do right now, and what I'm doing a lot of at this time of year, is any crops that are gone over, or this celery now has finished flowering and is quite tough, I'm actually going to remove this, because a big emphasis from August all through autumn is compost. So any material that I can get and start bulking up the compost bins so I can make as much compost as possible next year is going to be a key priority. But what I'm also doing is that I'm opening up spaces in the garden to put in extra crops. So if, say, next week, once this heat wave has gone over and I start sowing crops in modules, this area will be nice and clear and ready to transplant them as soon as they're ready to go out. So I can still get some extra food at the end. Even if it hasn't been a productive year, if you can finish on a high, the psychological benefit of that is going to be really important moving into next year's growing season. Now, just really quickly, if you've seen the compost pathway video, I wanted to give you a very simple update. Right underneath here, where we've been layering on stuff, we're actually creating this amazing quality compost that I'm really pleased with. The moisture in here as well is really, really promising. So we're just adding as many layers as possible and then walking over it, turning it a bit. It is going to be such a key part, I think, in terms of small gardens as a way to create compost without sacrificing growing space. And I think the amount of material here is going to more than mulch the beds either side. Hopefully we can start mulching a third bed as well. If you're growing food in response to the rising price of basically everything, one of the things that I suggest is choose 3 or 4 of your hero crops, the ones that you know are going to yield a lot of food, or ones that you enjoy eating and are going to feed you, especially over autumn and into winter. So a key one, for example, is kale. That's very bulky and that'll last through winter. What I'm stood right next to here are climbing French beans, and also runner beans should go into this mix as well. Beans need moisture for a good fruit set. So if there's any way that you can use grey water, you know, there's a lot of people having hose pipe bans now, so grey water and then mulching with a lot of grass clippings or anything that you can find, so you can get a proper crop off these. You can then freeze them, you can do whatever you want, but these produce so much food. So that's one of my priorities, is just looking after the climbing beans. So think to yourself, what are the 3 or 4 crops that you really need to protect as your hero crops that are going to make the biggest difference in terms of cutting costs or reducing the amount of food that you need to get from a shop. I will confess that I turned up to the garden today mainly to see how the crops are doing and to save whatever I can. But I did jot down some ideas for this video, and I'm going to read out some of the notes that I put down for this next section, which is actually about sowing seeds. And I've been reading a really good book that I can recommend that I think every gardener should have on their bookshelf. It's actually Charles Dowding's Winter Vegetables book. Yes, it shows you everything that you can start off in spring, for example, to enjoy over winter. But most importantly, it shows you the things that you can actually sow in August and September, and also sowings undercover to enjoy in your polytunnel all through winter. And I think that right now with this season, it's going to be quite a big challenge if it's going to stay this dry during September onwards. But I think gardening is a little bit about taking a risk, taking a bit of a punt, and one of the ways to minimize those risks is to actually just do a bit of sowing every week to kind of spread it out, and one of those sowings will work and it'll hit and it will work really well. So I've got enough water stored where if I don't get any more rain until early September, this garden should hopefully be fine. Anything after that, it's not going to look good. But some of the key sowings that I'm going to focus on kind of for mid-August is going to be winter radish, spinach, rocket, turnip, Chinese cabbage and chard. And I'm going to eke that forward into late August, where I'll also include lettuce, spring cabbage, salads, onion and pak choi. There are lots of other options as well, but those are going to be the key ones that I'm going to focus on to try and enjoy in terms of growing outside. And then in September will be a lot more sowing for undercover. And I think that for sowing these seeds, it's going to be a mix of sowing directly. As soon as this heat wave goes over, I'm going to be sowing a lot of things directly into the garden, but also a lot in modules just to give them a bit of a head start before bringing them outside, thinking about covering whatever protection that I can do for really, really cold weather. But you've got to be extra flexible, especially towards the end of the season. And I think it's really important to finish the season on a high, and there's so many things that we can sow now, so I do recommend you to get that book, give it a bit of a read and see the things that you can squeeze in, because after a bit of a challenge we just need something to celebrate, and there's still a lot of opportunity out there for us to enjoy for the rest of the season, and really importantly to utilize our undercover growing spaces over winter. So I'd really like you to get involved with this video, because one of the actual benefits of a challenging season like this is that it forces us to think outside the box and to find solutions. And it would be really nice to turn the comment section into an area where we're sharing thoughts and ideas, things that we found out. So anyone who's watching this and is feeling like they just need a bit of help or guidance, that the comment section can be a really positive, uplifting resource where we can all help one another, whether it's just for the rest of the season or building in strategies so we can be more resilient for the future. So it's just an open invitation to get involved down below in that discussion. So if you're looking more into ways of low-cost water storage, next week's video is actually going to show you our water storage at our other site, as well as a full tour, which is very exciting to share that properly. But this video right here is going to show you the low-cost water system that it isn't perfect, but it's practical, that we use here to save water because we're not on mains, so we can keep the garden flourishing as much as possible.